you're going to build a superpower, you would probably want to build it exactly where the United States is located. Because first of all, it's a very safe location. The United States is the only great power in the entire Western hemisphere. All the other great powers, the big thundering countries that really have moved world politics are all kind of packed together in Europe and Asia. And so as a result, they tend to fight amongst each other, and they tend to fear each other more than they fear a more distant United States. And in fact, they spend a lot of their effort trying to enlist the United States as an ally, or at least avoid its sort of focused animosity. And so as a result, this is one of the reasons why, even though the United States is the most powerful country in the world and should be the scariest, and weaker countries from a theoretical perspective should just gang up on the United States, that actually the United States has more allies than any other great power in history, because so many countries in Eurasia want the United States to back them in their local disputes there. So that gives the US a huge advantage.
Hello, I'm Paul Johnson. I'm with the Optimistic American. I'm here today with Professor Michael Beckley, who has written literally one of the best books that I have read in the last 5 years. It's called Unrivaled. Professor Beckley just makes an incredible point. You hear in the news on a nightly basis incredible negatives about the United States that are dredging up lots of fears about China overcoming the United States losing its position as a superpower. Professor Beckley has done a lot of research and even come up with some unique formulas in terms of how to look at this system, and I'm excited about being able to interview him today. His point is that there's no country, maybe in history, that comes as close to being the superpower that we are in the United States today. So, Paul Johnson, again, with the Optimistic American, we're here to talk about hope. Professor Beckley, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what I'd like to do before we get into the book is I'd like to talk about you, your journey, how you ended up getting to where you are, and why this subject started to become interesting to you.
Well, I think some of it has to do with my family. So I'm half Japanese, half sort of English, Irish descent. And so in the World War II era, the Japanese side of my family was interned, but several of what would have been my great uncles ended up serving in the U.S. military during the conflict. They were part of the 442nd Infantry, which I believe still remains the most decorated U.S. military unit for its size and length of service in U.S. history.
By the way, interned, does that mean they were imprisoned in the United States?
They were in the internment camps, in the United States. So my grandma was in the internment camps while her brothers were shipped off to fight in Europe, and one of them was killed in combat. Another received a Purple Heart because he was wounded in combat. And they were part of a unit that their motto was "Go for broke," because they wanted to prove their loyalty to the U.S. They wanted to show that they were true American citizens, and they made these tremendous sacrifices at a really dark time in world history and our nation's history. So I think somehow that, even though it's not something that my family talked about a lot, I think it's always just made an impression on me, because it showed me that great power politics, which we think of as like this sort of abstract thing, actually has direct impact on my own family's life and on the lives of millions of people around the world. And so I think that kind of pushed me in some ways. I think also just, I came of age in the 80s and 90s. So in the late Cold War, and in the unipolar moment of the 1990s. And so, the kind of movies and pop culture, I grew up watching things like Top Gun and Hunt for Red October. So I'm sure that also kind of clued me into this idea that working in national security could be a really exciting career. So I you'd have to lay me down on a psychologist's couch to really get to the bottom of it. Those are kind of the main influences on me.
Okay. And so you wrote the book Unrivaled. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you think the major theme of the book was, and then we'll try to dig into the details.
Yeah, I think the two main arguments are, first, that the U.S. economic and military lead over other countries, and in particular over China, is much larger than most people think. And then the second argument is that the United States actually has the best prospects to continue to build up its wealth and power in the coming decades than any of the other major powers. The things that drive long-term economic growth and military success, the United States just has a number of benefits that other countries don't have. So you have a big lead and the best prospects. That doesn't mean the United States doesn't confront threats from other countries. It doesn't mean that we can't screw it up, but we have a very strong hand. And so we just have to focus on playing that hand well.
All right. So talk about the lead first. Dig into that for me.
Yeah. So the first thing is, obviously China has been making a lot of moves, but people have sort of created this meme that China is a superpower, sort of on par or close to on par with the United States. And what I discovered in my research is that a lot of that is based on metrics of national power that aren't really that accurate. They're gross measures. So things like GDP, like just the size of China's economy. China clearly has a huge economy. By some measures, it's larger than America's. But what that measure doesn't capture are all the costs that go into having to sustain a population of more than 1.3 billion people. It would be sort of like calculating someone's wealth just by looking at how much they spend on their credit card. It's like, well, if you don't have the assets to back those things up, or maybe you just have a large family, a lot of mouths to feed, and that's why you're spending so much money. Maybe you're racking up a bunch of debt. If you don't subtract out all of those liabilities, you're systematically exaggerating the wealth of that person. And it's the same thing for China. So China's economy generates a lot of activity and a lot of output, but at extremely high costs. The costs of feeding, clothing, taking care of, cleaning up after, policing the world's largest population. And I found when you subtract out all of those liabilities, that the United States has roughly 3 to 4 times more wealth than China to deploy for whatever resources it wants to. And it's the same thing in the military sphere, where China has this humongous military, but a lot of that military is bogged down at home because China's in a very rough neighborhood. It's got 19 countries around its borders, most of which are either openly hostile towards China or unstable or some combination of those two. Its only ally is North Korea. And China also uses its military for internal security as well. And so when you subtract out all of the forces and the money and everything that goes into just securing China's borders and keeping tabs on the Chinese population, especially in the minority regions, China actually has a lot less military power to project abroad in the same way that the United States does, where the United States is surrounded by Canada, Mexico, and 2 huge oceans. And so border defense is something that is contracted out to civilian agencies for the most part, and the US military is free to project power internationally and has dozens of allies and hundreds of bases all around the world. So it's just a fundamentally different kind of great power than what China has. And I found that this basic idea of instead of focusing on gross resources, which is what the vast majority of newspaper headlines you read about China or analyses do, you need to focus on net resources. Like, how many economic, diplomatic, and military resources do countries have after you subtract out all of the costs they have to pay to generate those resources in the first place and take care of their populations?
So you gave a number of examples, which I found to be interesting. But let's again start with this. The GDP is the thing that many people are utilizing to kind of create the scare that says China's going to overpower the United States. You gave examples of places in history where countries with lower GDPs were able to defeat countries with higher GDPs. I thought one of the more interesting one was the war that your family fought as proud Americans, but we were fighting with the Japanese Empire. In that particular case, you pointed out how Japan had defeated China before we entered the war. Maybe if you could talk about that example and what that meant.
Yes, I mean, China's own history, I think, is illustrative. So China, for a big part of modern history, actually had by far the largest economy in the world, the largest GDP. It had in the 19th for most of the 19th century and going into even early parts of the 20th century, it had a huge economy. It had on paper a humongous military. Its trade volumes, even its things like its manufacturing output, just in sort of gross volume, was even larger than that of Britain. But we obviously know that
that's the 1920s, 1930s?
Oh, no. So this is more in the 19th century and going into the sort of first decade of the 20th century. But I'll get to Japan in a second. Okay. It's like the same story that gets told over and over again, where China looks really big on paper because it has a huge population. But for all those reasons I talked about before, it had all these costs, internal security problems, had a lot of mouths to feed. And as a result, a lot of its wealth and military power was sort of sucked away by internal issues. And so first the British come along in the 19th century, and Britain's economy is less than half the size of China's, but it's a much wealthier country because British workers are more productive. Britain has better technology to work with. And it's the same thing in the military sphere, where the British military, and especially the Navy, is just so far above what China is able to muster. And so the British come in, defeat China in a couple of wars, and then impose a series of what the Chinese call unequal treaties on China. And then, to your point, going into the 1910s, 1920s, and especially in the 1930s, Japan, which has a much smaller GDP than China, comes in and basically just inflicts apocalyptic brutality on China, just demolishes its military, it invades the country, and then occupies and essentially colonizes huge parts of Eastern and especially Northeastern China. And so the lesson to be learned is that, it's not enough just to have lots of gross resources. In the aggregate, you also need to have high net resources. And the way to do that is to be very efficient, to produce high output at relatively low cost. Japan, Britain did that much better than China. And China ultimately ended up paying the price.
Yeah, so China's GDP, obviously, it was much higher. Japan, if you can, again, dig into that even a little further. I'm just fascinated by the idea that a very small country, lower landmass, less people, a much lower GDP, what was it that they were doing that made them so much better militarily to be able to defeat the Chinese, who was better than them in all of those respects?
Yeah, I mean, the modernization of Japan, coming through from the 1860s going all the way up to the 1940s is really one of the most impressive cases of both rapid economic and industrialization and development, as well as military modernization. I mean, the Japanese regime essentially said, we don't want to happen to us what seems to be happening to China and other countries around the world, namely that Western imperialist powers are able to come in, use their superior technology, their greater wealth, and their stronger militaries to impose themselves. And so Japan went on this rapid industrialization drive starting in the 1860s. And by the time you get to the 20th century, Japan's technology is just at a different level than what China has. I mean, China, even going into the 1920s, 1930s, has very few vehicles that can drive its military forces around. So you have its military literally walking by foot, trying to get to battlefields, which means they can't show up on time for the battles they need to fight. Just some simple things like the rifles that they use, the way you have to reload them takes minutes sometimes on end, whereas the Japanese have automatic weapons and heavy mortars and tanks and modern fighter aircraft and bombers that they're able to bring to bear. And then Japan's ability to industrialize and just churn out all the material you need to sustain a long-term military operation is just completely different than Chinese industry at the time, which for the most part had either been taken over already by Japan or was just not operating at the same level. So it fundamentally comes down to a point of efficiency. How much input do you need to generate a certain level of output? And so countries that are just wealthier and more economically developed have figured out ways, either through a more able workforce or through better technology, or usually some combination of those two things, to just outproduce other countries. And that gives them a massive advantage economically, diplomatically, and ultimately militarily.
All right. So I want to geek out a little bit here. I loved your formula. I know that people who are economists, I think, will be interested, but I just wanted to explain to me. As I understand it, you think that we should be looking at GDP, but that we should be looking at GDP times GDP by GDP per person. Is that correct, or per capita?
So I mean, ideally, we'd be able to do what accountants do, which is like create a balance sheet for every country where you could put all their assets on one side of the ledger, all their liabilities on the other. And in fact, economists at the UN and the World Bank are basically trying to do that for countries. So they add up, everything that the country has, all different types of wealth, both tangible, produced products, as well as human capital, the skills embedded in their workforce, their natural capital, so their environmental resources that they can bring, and then subtracting out all the liabilities, things like debt, the pollution they have to clean up. Ideally, we'd be able to do this for every country, but obviously that's an incredibly painstaking task. You have to have statisticians going through, and especially for historical cases, we just don't have the fine-grained data to be able to do those kind of national accounts. And so for this doesn't matter for most policy analysis, but for political scientists who are trying to create theories of international relations that transcend particular eras, that can really apply across the different centuries, we need a basic measure of national power in the same way that physicists need a measure of energy or economists need a measure of money and value. And so there's always been this quest to kind of find one single indicator that can give you kind of a broad brush strokes look at how powerful different countries are and kind of size them up. And for a long time, political scientists have used things like GDP, or what they've done is created these indexes where they'll combine the number of military personnel a country has. It's like iron and steel output, how much electricity it uses, and some other random indicators to try to see who has more resources at their disposal. But all of these tend to be flawed because they look at countries in a one-dimensional space. They only look at how big countries are. They just assume the bigger the country, the more output, the stronger they are. My basic argument is that you need to add at least one more dimension to this, namely how efficient are those countries. So if you could think of it as just like a simple graph where on the vertical axis you have efficiency and on the horizontal axis you have size. And so if you could somehow plot countries and take account both of how big they are, but also how efficient they are, that would help crowd out countries like Singapore, which are very efficient, but very small, and so obviously not that powerful, but also countries like China and India today, which are very big, but not that efficient. Whereas a country like the United States scores highly on both the size and the efficiency measure, and so has a larger overall sort of amount of resources it can bring to bear. And I found just a quick and dirty way to do this was just to create a variable where you basically just multiply a country's GDP by its GDP per capita, because the GDP gives you the rough estimate of just how big is this country, how much stuff can it churn out, and then the GDP per capita is how much wealth can it produce per person, and that gives you a rough idea of how efficient the overall system is. This is obviously a very rough indicator. It's only really useful for big, international relations studies. I wouldn't recommend it for, people in the Pentagon or like people in the intelligence community who need to do much more fine-grained assessments of countries. But if you just need kind of a quick way to easily display the relative power of countries, I found that, I did all this battery of statistical tests and historical case studies. And I just found that this measure did a much better job than the ones that political scientists were currently using, which again, just kind of graphed countries on that single dimension, how big they are. They systematically exaggerated the power of countries with big populations like China and India today. And so I said we need to also take into account efficiency as well.
Okay, so let's move forward to today. China is obviously closing the gap purely on GDP, but you talked about the inefficiencies that they had during World War II with the Japanese, where the Japanese were much more efficient. How would you see the United States and China today on that score?
Yeah, so again, the bottom line figure is that the United States has roughly 3 to 4 times China's wealth, and this has to do with a number of inefficiencies in China. So one is just that China has to spend a lot to produce output. So the average Chinese firm requires twice the level of investment, twice the capital pumped into the system, and roughly 5 times the labor. So 5 times the number of workers or number of hours worked. So telemarketer calling me on my computer as we talk.
Oh, good. I'm glad it was you. My guys were all looking at me like I had done something wrong. They're fine with the guest doing it, but if I do it, I get in trouble. So
I'm terrible. It's probably, I blame it. It must be a Chinese influence. Right, disrupt their conversation.
There you go.
But anyway, what I was saying is, the average Chinese firm just takes twice the capital and 5 times the labor to produce the same amount of output as the average American firm. There's a lot less efficient. Environmentally, China has had to ravage a lot of its resources to achieve that same level of output. If you look at the Chinese workforce, one of the reasons Chinese workers are not as efficient as their American counterparts is, they don't get the same level of education. They don't have the same health as American workers. They suffer roughly 40% higher levels of chronic diseases. That obviously drags down their productivity. So it's looking at a lot of things like that, things that kind of drag down the overall efficiency of the system, that give you a sense of just the costs that every country has to expend in order to produce a given level of output.
Two things that you brought up that really brought it home to me. One was farming. I think that you pointed out in China, farming, they take about 30% of their workforce is involved in agriculture, and they still have to import food. In the United States, it's less than 1%, if I recall the statistic that you gave. And the other one that made it obvious to me from a military spending standpoint was the idea that, if you look at something like pensions, pensions may be an important thing to have, but if a larger portion of your military spending is spent on pension, that's not really helping you in fighting. That's not helping you in having the ability to deliver a product that you may need in defense or in offense of your country.
Exactly. Yeah. So on the farming point, I mean, economic development is essentially a transition from, just churning out agricultural, feeding your population and subsistence farming, to moving into industry and producing other forms of wealth. And so countries that can feed their population with less workers, a smaller share of their workforce involved in farming, just have a huge advantage. And so I was actually shocked to find just how high, roughly a quarter or more of China's workforce has to be working in the fields, just growing food to feed the huge population. And as you mentioned, China is the largest importer of food, agricultural products from other nations, because its land and its farm workforce is just not sufficient in order to produce what it needs. The United States, has a much freer hand because so much more of its workforce is devoted towards other industries. And then, something like personnel costs, whether it's in the military or in the civilian sector, if you're just having to spend your budget on, providing pensions, providing medical care, providing uniforms, providing housing, that's less money left over to buy weapons systems, to invest in military strategy and forces. And so I was also shocked to find just how high China's personnel, what they call the personnel costs of China's military. China has to maintain this mass army to patrol its sprawling borders and its internal territory. And as a result, it has to pay for all those soldiers, and maintaining soldiers is very expensive, having to pay their salaries and feed and clothe them. And that ends up sucking away a massive portion, more than 35% of China's military budget ultimately goes towards those personnel costs. U.S. personnel costs are high as well, but they're not the same percentage of the U.S. military budget as China's are of its budget.
All right. Now, moving forward, you said that there are three big issues: geography, demographics, and institutions. If you don't mind, let's walk through each one of them. How is the United States geographically situated better than China is from a long-term perspective, and why is that important?
So one, is that the location of the United States, like if you're going to build a superpower, you would probably want to build it exactly where the United States is located. Because first of all, it's a very safe location. The United States is the only great power in the entire Western hemisphere. All the other great powers, the big thundering countries that really have moved world politics, are all kind of packed together in Europe and Asia. And so as a result, they tend to fight amongst each other, and they tend to fear each other more than they fear a more distant United States. And in fact, they spend a lot of their effort trying to enlist the United States as an ally, or at least avoid its sort of focused animosity. And so as a result, this is one of the reasons why, even though the United States is the most powerful country in the world and should be the scariest, and weaker countries from a theoretical perspective should just gang up on the United States, that actually the United States has more allies than any other great power in history, because so many countries in Eurasia want the United States to back them in their local disputes there. So that gives the U.S. a huge advantage. Another part of U.S. geography is just that it's packed with resources. So you have this massive chunk, really one of the world's largest and most fertile sources of arable land is going right through the middle of the United States. The United States also has the most navigable waterways and the most natural deep water ports, which at first you might not think are that important, but they actually end up saving the United States a ton on infrastructure, because it's easy to move goods both into the country as well as then around the country. It's just because it's so much cheaper to move goods over water than over land. Whereas countries that have much more rough terrain or just don't have access to open waterways, are stuck in the sort of a lower level of productivity because of that. So those are sort of some of the geographic benefits that the United States has. It
I
also
think you
has.
said I think you said it was in your book. It was $2.60, and I know there's a little dated now to move product over land versus 16 cents to move it over waterways, and so
Yeah,
those waterways become important.
we're talking exponentially easier. I mean, just you can do this experiment yourself. Like take a heavy object, try to lug it, across your driveway, or put it on a little raft on a slip and slide or something, and just kind of push it across. And you quickly realize how important it is from just an infrastructure perspective to have natural, deep, waterways that are deep enough and large enough that can accommodate huge amounts of shipping. So these are just some of the many factors that go into.
Now compare that to China, if you would.
Yeah,
why is China at a disadvantage on those?
Yeah, so China, has many fewer deep water ports, and then the problem for China is also that its rivers are mostly not navigable, so it doesn't really help them from a moving goods around perspective. And so much of China's history has actually been trying to tame its rivers because they tend to overflow their banks anytime it rains. And then the other times China suffers from extreme drought. So you just have these oscillations in climate that just make it a much harder set of waterways to navigate, as well as just harder land to cultivate for things like food production. So, China not only has, it has roughly the same size of territory as the continental United States. But first of all, a third of China is, like the Himalayas, essentially. And then another huge chunk is desert. And so actually the amount of arable land that China has is many times less than what the United States has. And as a result, is just not able to produce on the same level agriculturally as the United States.
And are their borders are less secure, but you might explain that a little bit as well. I think many people don't understand how insecure they are on their borders.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you just look at a map, it suddenly becomes clear because, to the north, you have Russia, which right now, Russia and China are sort of, they've announced this no limits partnership. But for many decades, that this was a conflict zone. Russia and China. Russia, invades China, in the 19th century, and then you also have, even though the Soviet Union and China become allies for about a decade in the Cold War, they quickly become chief enemies starting in the 1960s after the Sino-Soviet split. And they end up fighting a war in 1969 on their shared border. And that border between China and Russia was actually one of the most militarized borders on the planet during the Cold War. So even a friend like Russia can't be taken for granted. Obviously, if you go east, you first have the Korean Peninsula, where, yes, North Korea is technically an ally of China, but obviously China has to worry that, first of all, North Korea could collapse and you might have millions of refugees coming across that border, or that North Korea might instigate some kind of nuclear conflict right on China's border. China had to fight the Korean War to obviously push the Americans and the South Koreans down the peninsula, and so has to maintain forces ready to act in some kind of Korean Peninsula contingency. Then you go further east and you hit Japan, which is, the hated historical enemy, the one that really just just all out invades China in the 1930s and occupies it. And then going down on the maritime, you have this chain of American allies where you have both Japan and South Korea, but then the Philippines, and then you go down into Southeast Asia and you have a number of partners. And so as a result, China in the South China Sea, for example, contests waterways with more than half a dozen countries where, they say this is our exclusive economic zone and China says, no, this is our territorial waters. And so China has to fight off all these Southeast Asian countries. And then to the west, you have India, where, which they just recently rumbled in the Himalayas, where you had Chinese and Indian soldiers beating each other to death with clubs and sticks, and both sides massing military forces on their shared land border there. And then the other borders are with, Central Asian countries, which, while they may not be openly hostile, they have large Muslim populations that border China's Muslim minority region in Xinjiang, where China has imposed, martial law and is worried about ethnic separatism and has always had to worry about cross-border connections between whether it's Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, any of these countries that may have spillover effects. And so they have to basically wage a low-level war on terror there in order to make sure that you don't have Islamic radicalism, spilling into Western parts of China. So if you just take a basic tour around China, and then you also factor in just the environmental limitations of China and how much of China has been destroyed through pollution as well over the last 30 years. Half of China's rivers have disappeared. 60% of its groundwater is so polluted. The Chinese government says you can't even touch it, let alone drink it. So you can't use it for agriculture or industry. I mean, just all these factors come together, and it just makes for a much more rough neighborhood that China is located in than where the United States is.
I found it interesting. I think it was the East China Sea where you talked about the differing nations that all had kind of claim to it, because we all know that China has been claiming that they're now kind of in control of it. And the question that we asked was whether or not the United States was large enough to be able to oppose them. But one of the things that you pointed out in your book was it's more than the United States. There are a whole group of other people who have a different point of view. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think we tend to think of the U.S.-China rivalry as this sort of bilateral standoff between two countries. But the United States not only has dozens of allies, but even countries that aren't allied to the United States are highly incentivized to push back or balance against China because they are inherently threatened by China because they're close to it. They're in its region, and historically, a lot of these Southeast Asian countries historically were basically turned into vassals by the Chinese empire, and they certainly don't want a repeat of that today. And it comes into tangible effect in these territorial disputes, where in the South China Sea, if you just look at the countries around its border, they claim relatively modest areas off, a couple hundred miles from their coastline. China's claims encompass more than 80% of the South China Sea. And so while on the one hand, that means China is very ambitious, it also means it encounters a lot of blowback because each of these countries is sort of defending and trying to find ways to push China away from their coastline. And so even though the United States doesn't always get directly involved in these disputes, it kind of benefits in a way because these countries act as a force multiplier for the U.S. Navy, because the U.S. Navy doesn't always have to be the one on call. Sometimes it's the Indonesians who are going out and, kind of getting into shoving matches, or the Vietnamese who are aiming missiles at Chinese naval ships. And so as a result, the U.S. just sort of strategically benefits from the fact that there are many countries around China that are scared of it and that are taking actions to try to contain it in a way that is similar to what the overall U.S. strategy is in the region.
Seems like there's also a lesson for us to think about not making people afraid of us, but instead recognizing that we're their partners. Demographics. Hit on demographics. What are the big differences between China and the U.S., and how does the U.S. have an advantage on demographics? And why do demographics matter?
So demographics matter because they're the fundamental engine behind any country. A country is, at the end of the day, only as good as its people. And in particular, you need the ideal demography is if you have a lot of workers who then have relatively few dependents to take care of. They can spend most of their time working and producing wealth and consuming and paying taxes, and less of that money has to flow to supporting a huge elderly population, or a big population of people that are sick or unhealthy or struggling. And so the more productive and young and highly educated you can have your population, the much better you'll do geopolitically. That's always been true internationally. But for the United States, I think this is one of the key advantages, because the U.S. is one of only three. If you take the world's top 20 economies, only 3 of them are going to have a workforce that is going to grow over the course of this century. All of the other 17 other largest economies are going to have shrinking workforces, and in many cases, like rapidly shrinking workforces. At the same time, they're going to have ballooning elderly populations. And China really leads the list here. I mean, China's demographic crunch is going to be especially severe because of the one-child policy. So and this is not like a long-term thing. This is going to bite over the next 10 to 15 years. So just by the early 2030s, between now and then, China is going to lose roughly 70 million working age adults from its population. So just take China's workforce.
How many?
70 million. So roughly the size
wow.
of like a population the size of all of France. Just take that out from China's workforce. And at the same time, it's going to gain 120 to 130 million senior citizens. So that's like an entire Japan of senior citizens like stacked on top of China. And this is just between now and the early 2030s. And then after 2035, China really just falls off a demographic cliff. It's going to add more than 100 million additional senior citizens and lose more than 100 million additional workers. And so, some projections think that the Chinese population in just 50 to 60 years is going to be half of what it currently is. So it's just a massive shrinking as well as a rapid aging of the population. And this all has to do with China's peculiar population history. So basically, in the 1950s and 1960s, China has this big baby boom because China had been, destroyed through civil war and the war with the Japanese and the so-called century of humiliation. So Mao Zedong said, we need to repopulate our country. So he encouraged Chinese families to have many children, and Chinese families obliged. The population surged more than 80% in just 30 years. But then Chinese leaders started to worry about overcrowding. And so they did a 180 and implemented the one-child policy in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And so what you've had over the last 30 years is that big baby boom population were in the prime of their working lives. And they were, not only did they have relatively few children to take care of because they weren't allowed to have them, but they also had relatively few elderly parents to take care of because so many of the previous generation had been killed in the Great Leap Forward, where you had this massive famine, the Cultural Revolution, as well as earlier in the war with the Japanese. So China literally had 10 workers for every retiree in its population. Most countries don't even get to 5. I think right now the United States has 3 to 4 workers per retiree. But the problem is for China now, that's going to flip over the next 30, 40, 50 years, where that huge baby boom population is now starting to retire and fall on the backs of this tiny one-child generation. So that's why China's, many countries are going through aging and have large elderly populations they're going to have to take care of. But China, it's just like an order of magnitude worse than these other countries because of its draconian population policies. So whereas the US workforce is going to grow, China's is going to rapidly shrink. And while the United States does have a large baby boom population to take care of, the millennial generation is also very large. And so you're at least sort of constituting the population with a lot of young people as well as immigrants from abroad, whereas China, definitely doesn't want immigrants for internal security reasons. And there's no way for them to escape this demographic trap because it takes 18 plus years to grow a full functioning, maybe more than that, a full functioning adult. So even if China somehow flipped a switch right now and literally started forcing Chinese families to breed and create children, that would actually make the problem worse for the next 20 years because you'd have more children to take care of. So this is really just an intractable, absolutely devastating problem because it just means, many, many tens of millions fewer taxpayers, consumers, and workers, and many more people that China's going to have to take care of.
All right. And then last, institutions. How are we better than China from an institutional standpoint?
Yeah, I think neither country is really covering itself in glory from an institutional perspective. It's hard to look at American politics today and say, oh, yeah, that's a great, well-functioning, wonderful system for running a country. So certainly things like political polarization, just the level of animosity between the two parties is very concerning. And to me is actually maybe the potential Achilles heel for the United States. That said, a democratic system where you at least have competing parties for power and you have transitions of power is still much better for long-term power generation than what China seems to have become now, which is essentially a neo-totalitarian dictatorship. Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, has appointed himself president for life. He's stacked all the highest levels of the Chinese government with his cronies. His so-called anti-corruption campaign has purged more than 1 million senior level CCP officials. So that's like a generational clean out of the upper echelons. And it's created an environment of absolute fear and an echo chamber where there's just no way to make rational policy decisions. Decisions are being made for politics. And so there's many examples of how this is already dragging down China's economic trajectory. So for example, private firms produce the vast majority of China's real wealth, but under Xi, roughly 80% of the loans and subsidies doled out by Chinese banks are given to these state-owned enterprises, many of which are actually loss-making. So they destroy value and they're basically being propped up with government handouts. China has rolled out an Obama-sized stimulus package roughly every 6 months over the last 10 years to just continually stimulate the economy. And a lot of this money is going to very inefficient firms. Another example is that bad economic news has basically been outlawed unless it's explicitly sanctioned by the regime. And that obviously makes it hard to, course correct and to make savvy reforms to keep the economy going. Local leaders are now scared of engaging in the kind of economic experimentation that actually drove a lot of China's earlier economic development, because they're worried that if they ruffle the wrong, if they disrupt the wrong patronage networks, take out the gravy train of the wrong official, they may end up in an anti-corruption investigation and find themselves disappeared or in jail. And so it just creates this environment of fear where, can you imagine trying to be an entrepreneur in that kind of environment? I mean, not only do you have to, what entrepreneurs have said is they spend the vast majority of their time schmoozing with Communist Party officials, because that's the only way to really get a loan from a Chinese state-owned bank. That's the only way to get the permits you need, to set up your business. And the same thing for innovators. I mean, what we've seen historically is that in authoritarian regimes, innovation eventually starts to go down from outside the state, because if you're a private innovator, you always have to worry that you're not going to be able to secure the intellectual property to the gizmo that you just invented, that the state will just take it, or because there's no legal protections, because there aren't objective court systems, that you just have no way to secure the property rights. So why even bother, spending all that time and money trying to innovate for the next level? So anything that's not coming directly from the state is not going to happen. And so while authoritarian regimes may be very good at a rapid rise from sort of an agrarian society up to the highest levels of industrialization, because they can get things done, they can move peasants off land and stuff them into factories and force them to work. What we've seen time again historically is that authoritarian regimes have a harder time transitioning to long-term sustainable innovation and entrepreneurship, just because the environment just doesn't incentivize people in that same way. Everyone's looking to the state and looking for handouts from the state, looking for guidance from the state. And as a result, it becomes this highly politicized system. And China just seems to be going so far. For a while, China had a pretty smart form of autocracy where they actually rewarded economic and technocratic competence. But increasingly, it just seems like a cult of personality dominated by Xi Jinping. And at least historically, that has not worked out well over the long term.
Yeah, the innovation thing, one of the things that's clear to me is that innovation creates disruption. Disruption usually takes on a status quo. The status quo is usually pretty good at getting involved in a party. And when you only have one party, that status quo can end up becoming the death of you if you're the innovator. On the other hand, we have some differences of opinion in the United States, but sometimes that works to our advantage because it allows the new innovators to be able to have a chance of getting back in and being able to disrupt, because the status quo has a hard time deciding which side to pick.
Exactly. I mean, you need a system that keeps people that lose in the short term in the system. So they don't say, oh, I'm going to rebel against the system. They say, okay, I'm going to try again in the next election cycle, or I'm going to try again in the next round of innovation. And so democratic systems, for all their flaws, do that. And I would also point out that, democracies always look worse than authoritarian regimes, just because the whole point of an authoritarian regime is like, you don't air the dirty laundry, you suppress it. You always want to make the regime look all knowing and all powerful and all wise. Whereas in democracies, there's always at least one opposition party that their whole purpose is to air the dirty laundry of the ruling party. And so it looks really ugly, and it's like sausage making. You never want to see how it's made, but it can taste pretty darn good when it comes out, because it actually leads to a better system overall. And I think there's just so many examples in China, like what happened to Alibaba and Jack Ma, right? This entrepreneur comes up, he starts what becomes the largest e-commerce firm in the world, and then basically starts running his mouth a little bit too much for the likes of President Xi, and has now had his empire sliced in half and sold off to all these other firms. He disappeared himself for months on end, when I'm sure the authorities were basically holding him and explaining to him why he needs to basically fall in line and toe the party line. So, I mean, that just shows you the difference in an environment for high-level entrepreneurs in China.
Yeah, I think my favorite line is, someone saying that what they love about China as an economist is how great their growth is and how well their economy is doing. But what they love about the United States is when it's not going well, you're actually allowed to say so. So it's all right. So something that happened after your book, and I'm really interested in your point of view on this, is what's obviously happened in the Ukraine. Has that changed your point of view in terms of the United States power or magnified it? Specifically as it relates to Russia and what's happening with them?
Yeah, so I think this is a perfect example where I think you can two things can be true at the same time. The United States can be vastly more powerful than other countries, yet those countries can still pose major threats both to the United States as well as other countries around the world. So I actually think Russia's invasion of Ukraine over the long term is basically going to cripple Russia as a major power. I mean, the economic consequences from the sanctions, the devastation that's being wrought on its military right now, the diplomatic isolation, and the fact that it may just have to become almost like an appendage of China because there are just so few countries that are going to be either able or willing to buy what it has to offer, its oil and gas. And so even so, Russia, I think over the long term has weakened itself. Yet at the same time, I'm incredibly worried about an escalation of that war into something that can involve actual clashes between NATO and Russia, or just the horrific humanitarian disaster that's being wrought on the Ukrainian people. So I think that's just a fantastic example, but I don't think it changes the sort of 35,000 foot level of vision of this world that I think we live in, which is one where the United States is sort of head and shoulders, from just like a raw power perspective, head and shoulders above other countries. Yet there are, of course, also these other lower level sort of second tier great powers that are very powerful within their respective region, can invade other countries. Like I'm also worried about a Chinese potential invasion of Taiwan for similar reasons. But they can still, really put their imprint on the map, even though they don't rival the United States as a sort of a comparable superpower.
By the way, you did a wonderful job in your book of describing what that might actually look like and how that may play out. I was just fascinated to hear it and to listen to it. All right, so let me hit on another topic. A lot of economists who are worried today, they obviously worry about the amount of debt that the United States has. They also worry about our losing being the corner of the world's reserve currency. Are those things that worry you? Are they really just not in the scope of what you look at? Can you give me input on that?
I mean, the debt is definitely something directly in the scope because it's one of those big liabilities that you have to subtract out. I mean, yes, the United States may produce a lot of wealth, but its debt has just surged so much, especially, obviously wrote the book before COVID, but, the amount of the deficits that we had to ring up, to stimulate the economy during the crisis have really put the United States in a hole. And so, a lot of what goes on in the book and my analyses now, it's not so much that the United States, everything is great. I mean, there's so many problems in the United States and the debt is certainly one of them. But it's just when you look relative to where other countries are, you realize that in many cases, their problems are even worse. And so China's debt is just so much worse than US debt, even before COVID, just because of the number of the ghost cities that were built that are never going to be paid back. The fact that, a third of the infrastructure that China has built, according to economists, has no chance of recouping the value and the amount of money they had to spend to build all that stuff. The Belt and Road Initiative. What?
How many ghost cities did you say there were?
So economists have looked at this using satellite data where they can look and see like these big metropolises, these entire cities that have been built, and yet there's no activity going on. There's no electricity being used. There's just no cars. You just don't really see any kind of activity going on. And so they've been able to actually count these, and they estimate there's more than 50 cities that have been built that basically are mostly unoccupied. And there's other data sources that suggest roughly 25% of China's housing around the country is vacant. And so you have this huge real estate market where people have bought second and third homes and they don't live in them because it's all speculation. And that does not bode well. We know all about housing crises here in the United States.
We do.
One is like an order of magnitude, potentially bigger. And so that's why China's having to, with the Evergrande crisis that some of your audience may have heard of, this big property developer in China, a lot of Chinese leaders are worried that their defaults on their debt could be the tip of this big iceberg that basically blows this bubble open. So so there's things like these ghost cities that have been built. So China's debt has increased more than 8-fold, even going into the eve of COVID. And now COVID, of course, has driven it even more into the red. I've seen estimates that suggest China took out more than $30 trillion of new credit over the last 10 years. So to give you a sense how big that is, that's roughly a third of the entire global economy. China has taken out and basically put on the credit card and issued new debt. So, I mean, these are just intractable problems. Every country, I think debt is one of these like global issues that so many powerful countries are going to have to deal with, but it's just whose debt is worse. And I'd much rather have the US debt problem than the Chinese debt problem.
Yeah, the one of the economists that I had on said, we definitely have a problem with our currency. We definitely could lose the world's reserve currency. He says, I just don't know who we would lose it to. He said, because at the end of the day, they all end up being worse than us.
Sorry to not address the other part of your question, but I actually agree with what you just said rather than what the initial part of the economist's point, because while the United States certainly has sort of played funny with its currency and has given other countries strong incentives to try to get away from the dollar, everything from our use of sanctions, which now countries realize, like if they're dependent on the dollar-based system, they're in deep trouble, to just the fact that we can run up debt and then inflate it away over time by printing more money. Other countries understand that gives us a big advantage and want to chip away at it. But the problem is it's just really hard to find any other currency that you would want to hold in a crisis. If you look at what happened to Britain, they used to have the reserve currency, and long after the British Empire kind of dissolved, Britain still had the reserve currency. So there tends to be a longer lag, and that's just because there's like a momentum, a tipping point that has to be reached where enough people shift over to another currency. And what we've seen both in the 2008 crisis, the COVID pandemic, people have flocked back to dollars. And it was especially egregious after the 2008 financial crisis, since it started in the United States, and yet it actually strengthened the position of the dollar because, when we sneezed, everyone else caught a cold, and then they came rushing back and bought dollars. So it's one of these, advantages to already having a lead that kind of is sort of self-reinforcing in some ways, and the U.S. would have to do a lot more. And I just don't, the euro after Brexit and all the chaos going on in Europe, I don't see how that can be competitive. Japan, the yen it's just too small, and Japan is shrinking as a country. And then China, with the amount of both political risk, the economic slowdown, and then this brewing Cold War between the United States and its allies in China, no, people don't want to hold yuan, and the Chinese government, frankly, doesn't want the yuan to be floating around as this global currency, because they need to be able to adjust the value of their currency to selectively stimulate their export sector.
Explain that a little more.
So
that's an important point.
Having a reserve currency means that it's widely used around the world, and that your money has to be flowing all over the globe. China doesn't want to do that for a couple of reasons. One is that what we saw this especially in 2015, 2016, when China kind of loosened capital control, so allowed Chinese citizens to start using yuan and taking their money out of the country. There was a massive exodus of money from China as rich Chinese families immediately try to buy property, in London and in New York and other areas, because they're trying to hedge their bets. They're worried that if the Chinese Communist Party goes down, or if their family becomes targeted by Xi Jinping and his cronies, they need a golden parachute. They need somewhere to flee to. So they get their kids into American universities, and they get their money outside the country as quickly as possible. And so when China opened up a little bit, there was this huge exodus. And so they quickly clamped back down and said, okay, if you're a Chinese citizen, you have to keep your money here. It basically has to go in a Chinese state-owned bank, or you can put it in the property market. And those are, or you can play on our stock market, which everyone knows is basically rigged by politicians. So most people just put it in a state-owned bank, and they receive very low interest payments. And that's one of the reasons the Chinese government has so much money to throw around, because they basically force Chinese citizens to load up their coffers with a lot of low interest paid lending. So that's one reason. The other is that China has always wanted to keep its currency relatively devalued, because that stimulates the export sector. Because if you're a Chinese exporter, you're usually getting paid in some foreign currency, usually dollars, and then you bring them back home to China and you exchange them for yuan. And if you get like 7 or 8 yuan for every dollar, then you make a lot of money, right? You're very prosperous in China, so you're incentivized to go into this export sector. And because China has traditionally tried to drive so much of its growth by dominating export markets, by selling into rich developed country markets, using cheap labor to sell into developed country markets. They wanted to be able to manipulate the value of their currency. Well, to do that, you have to keep a tight rein on where that money is flowing. You have to actually buy lots of dollars and hold those dollars to increase the value of the dollar and thereby decrease the value of the yuan. If you just open up and try to make the yuan a reserve currency, the yuan is going to strengthen because there's going to be tremendous demand for yuan, and you're not going to have the same kind of control over the value of the currency. So both to prevent capital flight as well as to stimulate the export sector, China traditionally has shied away from just going full bore, we're going to replace the dollar, although there are certainly Chinese policymakers that want to do that, but it's an internal debate. And I frankly don't think there's much hope of the yuan becoming a global reserve currency.
All right. What do you imagine your next book's going to be about?
I have a book coming out in August that's called Danger Zone, The Coming Conflict with China. And it's sort of the follow-up to the first book, which namely that what I worry about is not so much a China that rivals the US as a superpower, but it's one that basically starts to lash out as it doesn't really live up to the hype about its rise, that as its economy starts to slow, that as it gets increasingly strategically encircled by the United States and its allies, that it does what many great powers in the past have done when their rise basically came to an end. They try to find ways to, first of all, expand economically, to try to find new sources of wealth and new resources, as well as militarily to try to lock down and accomplish national aims before it's too late. We've seen this happen over and over again in history. You know, one example is that we talked about a little bit earlier is Imperial Japan. You know, Japan, why does Japan attack the United States at Pearl Harbor? Why does it take on a much stronger United States? Well, that's because Japan, its empire is basically being choked out by growing encirclement, growing embargoes that the United States was imposing on Japan for its brutality in East Asia. And the Japanese said, okay, we either can fight now, it's use it or lose it. We either have to fight now or we just wait, and then we're probably going to get weaker and weaker relative to our rivals. So what I really worry about is that the Chinese Communist Party is facing this slowing economy, which not only is going to make them weaker over the long term compared to the United States and other rivals, but also threatens the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, basically their contract with the Chinese people is, we will make sure that your bank accounts will grow. You will have more wealth than your parents' generation did, and certainly more than your grandparents' generation. And in exchange, you just do what we say. You don't get elections. You don't get this whole suite of civil and political rights. And the Chinese people have been totally fine for the most part going, the vast majority of Chinese people have been fine going along with that because, they know what poverty is. They know their history. And they know that their livelihoods, their incomes have increased so much more. But it's going to be a different story if China's economy continues to slow as it is. And I think there's lots of reasons. The demographics is one. The debt is another. There's many other reasons why I think China's economy is going to continue to slow. And again, what we've seen historically is that regimes don't react well. First, they dial up nationalism because they say, well, if we can't buy loyalty from our citizens, we need to get them all fired up and create foreign enemies for them to rally against. And at the same time, Chinese leaders, just from like a geopolitical, risk perspective, say, look, we're never going to have a better chance to take Taiwan than we are right now. We're never.
Sounds like Russia.
Okay, so Russia's actually one of the, so I wrote this second book with a historian at Johns Hopkins University, Hal Brands. And so we actually have a big part of the book is actually history, going through all the past cases where you've had a case of what we call a peaking power. That's a power that's been rising for a long time, and then its growth slows and it gets encircled and it starts to decline. And Russia is one of our cases. So Putin's Russia was growing like gangbusters in the 2000s because the price of oil and gas was very high, and Putin's popularity, is going up in Russia because he's bringing Russia out of its post-Cold War doldrums. But then, after the 2008 financial crisis, you have this collapse in oil and gas prices, and it basically takes down the Russian economy and takes down Putin's popularity as well. And that's when Russia starts saying, okay, we need new avenues of wealth creation. So what we're going to do is basically create like our version of NAFTA over post-Soviet states. We're going to force Ukraine and all these post-Soviet states to basically become markets for us to sell our goods into as sources of cheap material and cheap labor. And we're going to become kind of the metropole, and they're going to be our economic periphery. And we're basically going to build an economic empire. The Ukrainians, at least a big part of Ukraine, was not so eager to go along with that. They wanted to go with the EU. And so Russia viewed this as a major threat because Ukraine is this critical, economically critical area. Its geography, where it's located, its relative wealth and technological sophistication compared to other post-Soviet states. And so Russia got in this pulling match between the EU and it trying to bring Ukraine to its side. And this escalates where, the pro-Russian regime is overthrown in 2013. And then, you have eventually Russia goes in and basically says, okay, if you're not going to come with us willingly, we'll start using military force against you. And then that has, of course, provided the segue for the present day. So what we've found is this basic dynamic kind of rears its ugly head in many cases, some historical, like the Second World War, the First World War, but some very recent. And I think, if you look at the origins of the Ukraine crisis, a lot of it stems from Putin's need to find new sources of revenue, Ukraine's desire to go with the EU, and Russia not being willing to let Ukraine do that, I think plays a big part in the current controversy, in the current conflict.
All right. When that book comes out, I'm going to ask you to come back on and do a program for us. This has been wonderful. Let me hit one last question. A lot of people who are in our audience are middle-class people who are afraid about the long-term prospects of our country, about, again, being overpowered, overcome by foreign rivals, and not being militarily or economically as strong as we once were. What would you say to them?
So I would say we have it. It's a choice for us. We're a very lucky country in history in the sense that our success is not guaranteed. We have to make the right policy decisions and invest in both our domestic infrastructure as well as our national security tools. But we at least have a choice, whereas many countries just have been swallowed up and demolished just by the vice of world politics working against them. And so what I would say is, first, the United States has this tremendous suite of assets that it can use. It just needs to distribute them in a way that is both fair for its own citizens, renews the strength of the nation, and then also gives us the tools we need to prevent potential adversaries from making inroads. And so I think, what I try to warn in the book is that the risk is not that we're overtaken by some other country. There's really two risks. One is that a country like China or Russia makes inroads in particular areas in the short term that throw off the long-term balance of power. So in other words, like China can do a smash and grab operation over Taiwan, and we're not ready to defend Taiwan. Then China suddenly has this unsinkable aircraft carrier in East Asia, which strengthens its long-term military position, which then changes the long-term balance of power. Russia tried to do the same thing in Ukraine. So we need, even though we're stronger in the aggregate, we also have to look at these local balances of power, these particular areas of potential conflict, and make sure that we're ready there. Another area I worry about is sort of the balance of democracy and autocracy, because, especially China and Russia, to preserve their own domestic regimes, are trying to basically promote autocracy in various ways. They don't so much care about the ideology of other countries, but they definitely want there to be more autocracies because other autocracies won't criticize them for their own human rights practices. And they also have an incentive to make democracies look shambolic and dysfunctional and to sow chaos in democracies, because then that way their own citizens, Chinese and Russian citizens, won't look to the United States or Western European democracies and say, oh, we want to emulate that. We're going to demand civil and political rights. So they've been, mainlining in all kinds of disinformation, right into our Facebook feeds and our other social media feeds, and trying to turn Americans against each other. And that then leads to the second threat I worry about, which is that we sort of crumble from within. We've seen great empires fall because of internal corruption and basically because people turn on each other. And this can be especially prevalent, ironically, if you're a very powerful country, because if you're not that scared of your foreign rivals, you don't really need to band together in the same way that you do, like what the Ukrainians are doing right now, where they're saying, okay, we absolutely all have to come together and sacrifice to fend off a more powerful rival. For the United States, both our blessing and our curse is that we're relatively secure geopolitically, but that then means we become more polarized internally. And I think it's no surprise that if you look at a graph of polarization, so like political scientists have found ways to measure this, just how well Republicans and Democrats get along, polarization surges after the end of the Cold War. And I think it's no coincidence that you have the demise of a foreign adversary, and suddenly we look at each other and we can start squabbling amongst each other. So that's a clear risk, and I just worry that the level of polarization can get out of hand and basically prevent the government from functioning and even lead to sort of low-level strife within the United States. So to me, those are the two main risks: losing these local balances of power that change the long-term balance of power geopolitically, and then crumbling from within with an assist from our authoritarian adversaries abroad.
All right. And last, how, if people want to follow you, get your next book, get the last book, what's the easiest way to do that?
So I have a website where I try to post as many of my articles and research studies and things like podcasts and other TV and media appearances for free. And it's just michaelbeckley.org. If you just Google my name, Michael Beckley, it should hopefully be the first thing that comes up. And then both my current book and then the one that's coming out in August are available pretty much wherever books are sold. So Amazon, indie bookstores, Barnes and Noble. You should be able to just Google the title or just Google my name, and you'll be able to find the book if you want it. And I don't do social media. I recently got off of Facebook for various reasons, and I don't tweet, but I respond to emails. My contact information is available both on my website and through my institutions. I'm a professor at Tufts University. So if people want to get in touch, I'm always happy to talk about any of these issues. I love having discussions with people. So please just send me an email. We can get in touch that way. Thank
you so much. This is Paul Johnson, again, with the Optimistic American. If you get a chance, definitely get the book Unrivaled. It's got to be in one of your Optimistic American books, simply because it does the best description that I've ever seen that shows what a great position that we're in. And as Professor Beckley pointed out, some of our risks. I'd also follow him on michaelbeckley.org. This is a guy that's worth following. Very, very bright. Professor Beckley, thank you again so much for taking time today to talk with our viewers and to talk about hope.
Paul, thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you.